Welcome to the Cyber Insights Podcast, brought to you by the ISACA Greater Washington, D.C. chapter. I'm your host, Jim Wiggins, and I'm joined today by my co-host, Mr. Altan Bulut. And our guest today is Miss Laura Sawka. We'll be talking with Laura about the topic from compliance burden to business advantage, rethinking governance, risk management, and compliance, sometimes known as GRC. Let's get into the episode. Hi, everyone. Jim Wiggins here. Welcome to Cyber Insights, the show where artificial intelligence, cybersecurity, IT audit, risk management, governance, and privacy all come together. Presented by the ISACA Greater Washington, D.C. chapter, we bring you candid, expert-driven conversations on the challenges and opportunities shaping IT governance and digital transformation. I'm joined today with my co-host, Mr. Altan Bulut. Altan, how are you today?
Doing great, Jim. I'm looking forward to getting into the conversation there.
Absolutely. We're going to dive into today's conversation, like Altan was alluding to, and the topic is from compliance burden to business advantage, rethinking governance, risk, and compliance, also known as GRC. For too long, these ideas have been viewed as a reactive checklist exercise, but today we'll explore how organizations can transform GRC into a true strategic enabler, building trust, driving growth, and unlocking new opportunities. Our guest is Ms. Laura Sawka, the Director of Special Events at the ISACAGWDC on the Board of Directors, and also the founder of Sawka Advisory Group, LLC. Laura is a seasoned GRC executive who brings enterprise-grade governance and risk leadership to organizations seeking to scale with confidence. She is the former Senior Vice President of Security GRC at Salesforce, where she built and led a global program that supported hyper-growth revenue increases. With a career that began in IT audit and advisory services at KPMG, followed by more than a decade of leadership at Salesforce, Laura has proven that GRC can be more than just a compliance burden, it can be a competitive advantage. Today, through her advisory practice, she helps organizations turn compliance frameworks into market opportunities, risk into a strategic driver, and governance into a catalyst for long-term trust. Beyond her professional work, Laura is a CISSP, CISA, and Six Sigma Green Belt, an advocate for women's leadership, a mentor, and as I mentioned earlier, an active nonprofit board member for ISACAGWDC. Laura, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Jim and Altan. Happy to be here.
Absolutely. And Altan, how are you doing today? I think I did ask you as well, but I wanted to give you an
Yeah,
opportunity.
I'm very excited. It's a very evergreen topic, GRC on everybody's mind. So yeah, looking forward to get into the conversation.
Absolutely. So Laura, I tried to paint a picture of your background and, your experience over the last 15 or so years. Can you do us a favor, and maybe level set for our audience? How do you go about maybe defining GRC in today's business environment? What is it, and how do organizations use it? Can we start there?
Yeah, happy to. And I like to start with an analogy when I think about GRC. So, pretty simple analogy, which is your car has really good brakes so that you can drive your car really quick. And that's where I think GRC comes in terms of having really clear guidelines, really clear understanding of risk to be able to enable those business outcomes and assessing those controls and making sure those brakes are working to enable you to go fast. So GRC provides those guardrails to enable acceleration, governance in terms of the requirements and oversight, risk in terms of identifying and managing that cyber risk to be able to achieve business objectives, and then compliance, that ongoing demonstration that controls are designed and operating as intended to meet the organization's internal security requirements and also external obligations. So pretty critical to the car.
Understood. Understood. I've talked to business leaders in different sectors, and I think there's this kind of perception that GRC is sometimes perceived as kind of a burden. Why do you think that is? What do you think contributes to that perspective in terms of why an organization might look at that and go, we don't really want to go in that direction? Any thoughts on that?
Yes, it is definitely perceived as a burden, and I sometimes use the word tax as well to describe it. I think there's a couple of reasons for that. Number one is that I think GRC processes are often not integrated into existing business processes, so they get added on or bolted on to business processes. So that might mean manual control implementations, manual audit pools, sitting through evidence walkthroughs and interviews. It's just like after the fact activity that is occurring. And if you're a control owner, you probably feel like you're doing audit support work as a tax or a night and weekend job. It's not viewed as a core part of your job. I think also compliance can sometimes feel like red tape to an organization. It is viewed as like the blocker for why you can't do something, and that people will say, well, you can't do this because of compliance purposes. Well, that's often not the case. It's really about the risk that the control is trying to mitigate and articulating the risk and the way that you need to address that risk. And then last is this mindset of compliance being treated like a checklist. That's pretty pervasive in the in the industry. And that's something where if it's viewed as a checklist, you're literally just going through the motions. It's not creating business value. And so I think until you truly embrace building controls into your processes, embrace the fact that control maturity can be so meaningful to your organization, how control maturity feeds back into assessing risk, it's going to feel not very beneficial because it is this after the fact checklist view of things versus being fully embraced by the organization.
Understood. Understood. I think Alton was going to kind of provide the next question for you. Alton?
Yeah, so following up on the like framing, like unfortunately, a lot of organizations seem to perceive GRC as some kind of a burden. So, what do you think should be some of the initial steps when you want to reframe and position GRC as the business enabler that it is in reality? Like, what
Yeah.
would your like baby steps or maybe initial setup would look like in an ideal world?
Yes, it's a great question. And I think the first thing is really articulating the clear revenue impact that GRC can have on an organization. So think about audit reports, the amount of audit reports that get downloaded by customers and tying that back to revenue. Think about security questionnaires, security meetings, security audits. Again, these all are revenue impacting activities. New certifications, they can directly open new addressable markets for companies in international countries, various regulated industries. So there's like a clear direct revenue impact that comes from all of this. And then once you paint that story, it's really about shifting the narrative. So focus on not just compliance, but on maintaining and establishing sustainable customer trust. And this can also take the form of shipping secure products, proactive risk management, really focused on how you can support the organization with its goals. And then, as I mentioned earlier, embrace the steps. Don't just go through the motion. So don't treat policies and risk assessments as paperwork. Treat them as controls, investments, and that are going to be strengthening your overall security posture. And then lastly, as I alluded to earlier, really integrating risk and compliance into business processes. Don't bolt GRC on at the end. Embed it into checks and guardrails in your software development lifecycle process, embed it into decision making, and make sure that it's shaping secure outcomes, not just preparing you for an audit.
Yeah, absolutely. Makes a lot of sense. Just a quick follow-up on that. Do you think like when you think about a massive organization that is already that has its maybe dedicated GRC unit or maybe units that are uh, constantly working through their existing processes versus a like an up and coming business, maybe a startup or a smaller scale operation. How do you think that differs? Like, can a like smaller organization perhaps leapfrog some of that maybe uh, incorrect framing that may have existed in a larger organization in terms of setting up that correct frame of reference in terms of how to approach GRC?
I think there are ways that newer organizations can leapfrog. It's not necessarily through the framing, but it's direct steps that they can take early on. So if you're a new company, likely you're cloud native, so you have all the benefits of having API connectivity. So there are a number of GRC tools out in the market today that allow for continuous monitoring, connecting into API hooks. So if implementing that early on, like that is a leapfrog step. Also, integrating controls into your business processes from the beginning, that could significantly leapfrog you. And then third, if you're a relatively new organization, you probably don't have too much of a complex technology stack. It's
Mm,
probably relatively uniform. So
mm,
that will help you as well. I think
yeah.
bigger organizations tend to have a mix of on-premise, cloud, hybrid, they have complex technology stacks. Maybe they have a ton of acquisitions, and so they're playing catch up from all of this. The narrative, interestingly enough, with startups is still the same challenge though. Like a lot of startups just go in thinking, I just need to get this SOC report to
Mm,
get this enterprise deal closed, and then I'll deal with everything else later. That is a mistake. Thinking about how this can be a movement or a driver of sustainable trust, not only for your customers, but also for investors early on, would be game changing for many companies.
yeah, totally. Absolutely. Makes sense. Or two, Jim.
Awesome, awesome. Okay, so Laura, so we've gone in and we have kind of provided, kind of defined what we mean by GRC. Let's shift a little bit. Let's move into an area thinking about scaling in terms of the enterprise space. Um, I'm wondering if you might be able to start off with telling us a little bit about what you think the biggest challenge is that like very large organizations, like maybe Fortune 500 companies face when they're trying to scale GRC. Any thoughts on that?
Yes, and that kind of goes to what Austin was just raising, but a lot of these bigger companies, they have a very complex factors to deal with. They have multiple products, probably a number of them came through acquisition. They have global requirements that they're dealing with, so regulations on an international scale and across different industries, and they probably have a mix of technology stacks. All of that, if you like, is a multiplier effect of complexity, which makes managing all this extremely difficult. And then when you think about that, you need to be able to scale across all those different factors. So, where I tried to focus on was driving as much consistency as possible, but you still have to have permutations. Like, you're not going to get a single way of doing all those things for very good reasons. And so thinking about how can you drive consistency and repeatable playbooks in all of your processes, but still allow for the right level of variation to support the business. And then the last thing, and this applies to not only enterprises, but startups as well, change is going to happen constantly. That rate of change may differ depending on where an organization is in their growth and their, ability to take on risk. But thinking about when you're adapting to change at a big organization, you have a lot of pieces that you need to move to be able to adapt to that change. And so getting really good at change management and figuring out how to reprioritize your team, your resources, but still aligned to your strategy takes a lot of practice.
Yeah. So, Laura, in this process, what have some of the biggest learnings that you've had that you'd like to share, perhaps with some other GRC leaders in the industry?
Yeah. And one of the learnings, this is a little going on a little bit of a tangent from what I just talked about, but I think the biggest learning when I talk to other GRC leaders is about the need to invest in development and engineering resources to support the GRC team. Without investing in development and engineering resources, you don't necessarily have control of your own destiny. So it's really hard to do automated evidence collection. It's really hard to do continuous control monitoring. It's more challenging to have those conversations with a business about integrating these checks into software development lifecycle. And so treating GRC as an engineering outcome that you're trying to achieve and resourcing it appropriately, I think is a probably the biggest learning that I
Mm.
would impart on other leaders of how to set yourself up for success more quickly.
Okay, so it kind of trying to embed into more technical sides as well,
Yes.
more like a natural part rather than a separate silo that is trying to work in parallel, trying to
Right. You
cover.
don't want it to be
Yeah.
separate. You want it to be integrated, just
Yeah.
like you don't want security to be separate. You want it to be integrated into your
Hmm.
SDLC processes.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, Laura, were there any other like maybe leadership lessons that you can think of that kind of stand out in managing large global GRC teams? You talked about engineering, you talked about resources. What are some of the other considerations that might be useful for our listeners?
Yes. And I don't think these are lessons that are specific to GRC necessarily, but more just leadership on a big scale. So I would say the first thing is really around the power of having a clear vision and strategy. It's actually surprising how many teams don't have that. And so the teams can feel disconnected. Like they're not clear on, where they're headed and how their work is contributing to not only the organization, but the company overall. So I think really painting that clear picture for the team, for the rest of security, and also for your business partners about what's the vision, what's the strategy, how are you going to get there, and having that roadmap with clarity is incredibly beneficial for execution. The other thing I would say is the power of listening and being open to feedback. So one of the things that I used to do is have office hours for the team. Just, anybody on the team could check in and we would just discuss what's going on. Just creating that space for listening and asking questions and probing deeply. And I learned so much from those conversations. And then similarly with business partners, having ongoing discussions, ongoing dialogue with them to understand what was going on in their part of the world and how that impacts what I was focusing on and how we could help each other. The last thing, and I kind of alluded to this a little bit earlier, is change management. Like change is constant, literally constant, and but change management is also incredibly hard. So understanding how you as a leader process changes, how you help a team move through changes, how you understand whether the team has moved through those changes and what success looks like. Just that is literally a skill that you need to get good at. And I think recognizing that, practicing that, and then figuring out how good you are at it is really important to deal with just all the changes that are going on in business today.
Understood, understood. So, we've talked now, we've defined GRC. We've also now spent a little bit of time discussing about it from an enterprise perspective and some of the scaling challenges you might run into. Let's now kind of move into talking a little bit about compliance and maybe how it might be a growth enabler. We heard from you earlier that a lot of times organizations like to look at compliance as the piece of it that they don't necessarily like to do. But I'm curious if you have any thoughts specifically on how compliance might not necessarily be the redheaded stepchild or the thing that they don't want to that they have to do, but that it can also help maybe like unlock new market opportunities. And any guidance for our audience in that area?
Yes, I mean, I think this is literally the key to unlock new market opportunities. So for many industries and countries, you need compliance. It is whether that be your key or you could use the ticket analogy, it is the ticket to play in the game. If you don't have it, you're not in the game. And so, people try to sell into these markets, but then they'll get way down the deal cycle and realize, oh, I have a massive roadblock in front of me. I need to get compliance with a regulation or with a various certification. It can be a huge issue and like a major escalation chain. And so thinking about where is your organization investing? What areas do they want to be focused on? And building a roadmap to support those investments is absolutely key. And then you can measure the direct revenue impact of how much addressable market is that opening, how much revenue are you bringing in year over year. And then there's also the maintenance of it as well. So if you have an ISO report or a PCI report or SOC report, that is paying you out dividends year over year. Customers are having trust conversations because they recognize that you're providing that on an ongoing basis. So not only is it opening new markets, but it's supporting existing customers and renewals. And then the last thing I'll say is that achieving certifications or compliance can actually be a market differentiator as well. If you're the first to a market because you have compliance with some new requirement, that can be a big deal because you're able to sell into that market before your competitors are able to sell into that market.
Understood, understood. So just quick follow-on question. So I guess if we think about the European Union, you're thinking about GDPR, you're thinking about the EU Act around AI. Those are probably good examples of kind of what you're alluding to?
From a regulatory standpoint, yes. There's also a whole slew of certifications like um, public sector is a big one of that. In Australia, IRAP, Japan, ISMAP, you got UK, Canada, Protected B. Like there's so many of them, based on industry. And again, it is literally the ticket to be able to play in that market.
So one final question, I'll throw it over to Alton then. So how does an organization then decide, is it all just based on what markets they want to go into? And is that then how they then figure that out? Or is there kind of a recommended approach, like you should go over here first and then, because I assume there might be some level of transference, if you will, of some of that capability between markets.
Yeah. So some of it is optional, some of it is not optional, right? So some of those that you mentioned from a regulatory standpoint, I mean, they are required, right? GDPR is a good example, right? It is required. So that's a little different than I want to enter, the public sector market in Australia, which is more of a business decision, right? So I think thinking about which ones do you have to do, which ones are more business-driven outcomes, and then building a roadmap based on, again, what are the key priority markets, and then where do you want to be invested? And these are not all equal. The level of effort can vary dramatically for these various certifications and levels of compliance. And some of them also make logical sense to kind of add on to each other, like a pyramid where you're tiering things. And so that's where I think having someone who's really well versed in this can provide strategic guidance on what would that certification roadmap look like, what's the best way of approaching it. Maybe getting, like a tiered approach is better. Each certification individually can be quite a lot of work. So thinking about how to approach going after a number of these together or in tandem, and then how to build controls that are going to scale to be able to hit the right foundation to be able to get these additional certifications.
Yeah, so Laura, when we think about achieving these certifications for companies of various sizes or occupations of areas of operation, like a lot of times we see that they're focused on getting the certification as soon as possible, or considering that as a like a time-bound activity. Like you need to do certain things, you need to check some boxes, and you get the certification, and you're good to go. Like,
Mm.
how do you see the difference between like achieving a certificate, getting a certification for a given compliance standard, let's say, versus embedding that into a growth strategy, embedding your compliance overall into the strategy?
Right. Yeah. And I think just framing the question a little bit differently, it's like,
Yeah.
what does it mean to have checkbox compliance
Mm.
versus having
Yeah.
compliance that is going to build sustainable trust for your
Yep.
customers?
Yep.
And the biggest thing is really embedding it into your controls.
Mm.
So again, don't put a band-aid on it.
Mm.
Really, build that muscle into it. And what this will do is when we talk about having all these frameworks, all these different countries and industries and everything, is it builds this really strong foundation for you to be able to say, I can test this control differently and for all these different certifications, but I know the control is going to operate. So when I talk about building into the controls, I mean using automation to build it in, like as an engineering process, building checks and guardrails into software development lifecycle, building in that you're going to be able to generate evidence that the control is operating on an ongoing basis, building it in that you can monitor that control so you have visibility into if it's working effectively on an ongoing basis. That all has to be a part of it because compliance is not a one-time deal. It is, you have to go obtain it and then you have to maintain it. And I think if you focus on the maintenance of it, that is what allows you to have sustainable processes that you can demonstrate on an ongoing basis, improve your overall posture of your organization, and set you up for greater success.
I, that makes a lot of sense. Also, like as a like maybe follow up, when we think about growth strategy, like as we previously discussed, touched on a little bit, companies might decide to move to a different jurisdiction or totally different geographies. So, in terms of defining what that growth strategy might look like and how it interacts with compliance requirements going, how it's gonna interact with the future compliance requirements. Uh, yeah, like, is there a way for organizations to like make that part of the culture in a way so that like even if you like decide to move into Europe or different maybe a different set of jurisdictions that you'll have to uh be cognizant of their like compliance requirements or frameworks. If you got it right, let's say in a culture or maybe operational perspective, you can still expect pretty much most of your control, if not all of your controls to be compliant. Would that be part of that the growth strategy, you think? Like because, I mean, trying to again tie it back to growth, like from very geographically isolated company, let's say just operating in the US, 2 years from now decides to become global. And so like the difference again, like if they only focus on US specific controls, that might make it difficult for them to grow and become global, right? So
The
how do
way
you
that
see
I
that? Yeah. maybe if you
Sorry.
can freely comment on that. It's
Yeah,
just like
yeah, yeah.
just the thought, not necessarily a specific question, but tying that to culture maybe a little bit.
Yes. So I think a couple things. Um, when you think about compliance, it sh I feel strongly that it should be part of the product roadmap. So just like you're
Mm,
going to build features
mm,
out for your customers to meet their needs in different industries and maybe different parts of the world, compliance should sit at that same point, right? So
mm,
you're going to be building out what you need to be able to meet your customers' needs. Compliance should be 100% part of that roadmap. That is a cultural change in of itself to think about compliance like a product feature. Number two, when you think about how to manage all of this, um, I'm a big fan of a common control framework so that
mm,
you are bringing in all your different regulations plus your own internal security policies, and you're saying what is the common listing of requirements that we're going to be managing as an organization. And when you start to do that and you start folding in all these different
mm,
frameworks, you see a lot of commonality.
mm,
There's differences in the way the controls are worded and the frequency and everything, but like you're going to get to a point where like 80/20 rule, you start to get really good coverage of a lot of
mm,
these frameworks. And then when you're evaluating different frameworks, what you're adding on is a lot less because you've covered so much of it. Now, if you have to build out different infrastructure or different regions for operating, of course, that's another story. But
mm.
you start to get a really good baseline of compliance and security controls that can support the foundation for these additional add-ons that you need to do.
Yeah, like getting to the essence of the controls and the universal truth, if you will, if it makes sense. Like
Yeah, I mean,
wherever you are, there is the right way to do things, right?
right. There's only so many ways that you
Hmm,
can do access provisioning and deprovisioning,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
Like
yeah,
every framework is going to require that. How quickly you provision or deprovision maybe will be specified, but that's going to be in every framework.
yeah, absolutely.
Awesome, awesome. Okay, so one final question, and then we'll move on to discussion around automation, because I know that's something we talked a little bit about previously. But wanted to know, and I think you've kind of alluded to this to some extent already, but you discussed the idea of it, having GRC, helping build trust. Can you maybe talk about for a minute any particular cases when GRC has been a deciding factor in building long-term trust for an organization? We don't want you to necessarily, uh, put anybody on the spot or divulge any, client related information, but can you talk about it maybe just from a big picture perspective in that respect?
Yes, I mean, I absolutely think that it is a deciding factor in long-term trust because trust and transparency has to be earned over time and it can be broken quickly. What for a variety of reasons. The biggest example or one example that really came to mind when I was thinking through this is public sector compliance, I think, is a really, really good example here. So, in the US market, to be able to do work with the federal government, you have to get FedRAMP compliance. And a key part of that relationship is your authorizing agency. And that authorizing agency that is going to authorize your service not only has to have that trust that you're going to meet the requirements in the beginning, but then you have this long relationship with them. You're doing continuous monitoring on an ongoing basis and looking at your vuln scans and going through, the annual testing and your POAMs and everything. And so it is this very long relationship that you need to demonstrate over and over and over again that you are taking the right steps to maintain your controls in a way that aligns to the requirements. You're being transparent with them along the way. And that's a relationship that I think really speaks to how compliance is critical for maintaining that long, sustainable trust with clients.
That makes sense. That makes sense. I'm almost thinking about reputation when you talk about that, right? Because an organization effectively builds a reputation and then they use that reputation to maintain that relationship on an ongoing basis.
That's right.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, so let's move into automation. I think we talked a little bit about it, not much, but we just kind of touched on it briefly. Now we want to talk about, how technology automation and kind of risk strategy kind of work within the context of GRC. I'm going to throw it over to Alton for the next couple of questions.
Yes, so Laura, we talked about how engineering and development teams need to be part of the picture conversation, especially when we're trying to uh, get get beyond like manual checks, a lot of like tedious compliance tasks, and to make sure that those can be automated so that people can be freed up to focus on the most critical and impactful aspects of the work. So where do you see in this picture like automation making the biggest difference, some of the biggest differences in enabling GRC in the long
Yes.
term?
Great question. So thinking about this, there's kind of two different ways that I break down that question. The first one is the control environment, the second one is the GRC processes, and the third that is the impact that it can have on GRC. So first, in the control environment, automation can be extremely impactful for improving the maturity of the controls. Again, going back to embedding those controls into business processes, automating those controls, building the checks and guardrails in to make sure those controls are operating effectively before content gets into production, uh,
Mm,
being able to pull evidence that those controls are operating effectively, and being able to monitor all the controls operating effectively. All of that is through technology and automation, and AI can definitely help there as well. And when you do all those things, it allows you to get to a higher level of control maturity in your environment, which means more consistent outcomes from a compliance standpoint. Then take the GRC side of the house. So thinking about how are you managing controls? We talked about common control framework, new regulations coming in. You know, automation AI could be very helpful for taking a first pass at reviewing some of that, mapping controls together. Obviously, you'd want to review it in detail, but
yeah,
that can
yeah.
take some of the grunt work off. Policy management, drafting policies, drafting standards, again, taking that first pass on it. Even risk management, thinking about recommendations based on other risk assessments you've done. Again, first pass on some of these things. Executive reporting, that's another good use case. But when you do all of these things together, it really allows your GRC team to be able to elevate itself. So no longer are they stuck in these administrative, burdensome processes. They can rise above that, and now they can be the strategic advisor to the business, which is where the true
Mm,
value is.
mm,
So having those conversations with the business, where's the business headed? Where are the investments headed? Where's the technology shifting? How do you integrate this? That's where GRC should be focused, not
mm.
focused in the checklist world that's happening.
Yeah, absolutely. So, do you see any difference between company sizes, like companies of different sizes, or maybe industries, or even platforms that they may be primarily operating in? I believe you mentioned that like startups, smaller companies tend to be cloud native. A lot of their IT tend to be like abstracted away from the lower level operations. Do you see any like difficulties in some types of industries or maybe like legacy types of operations versus smaller operations in terms of integrating automation into those like GRC processes? Like how do you
Yeah.
see that?
I mean, I think as we talked about in the beginning of the conversation, complexity can mean a lot of different things. Complexity in terms of technology footprint,
Mm,
products that you
mm,
have as well, industries that you're operating in.
mm,
Anytime you layer in one or
mm,
more of those factors, that makes this whole thing
mm,
more complicated.
mm,
So if you have, a product operating in a straightforward environment, maybe you've built out automation in the beginning, get cloud native is helpful from an API connectivity standpoint.
mm,
Yes, I think you can accelerate this trajectory, but that doesn't mean that organizations of any size can't accomplish this. It does require a clear strategy, clear
mm.
leadership, a clear plan of attack on how you're going to tackle all of this. And the level of effort might certainly differ as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So, tying to the automation perspective, how can this technological shift enable organizations to move compliance from a reactive to a more proactive endeavor overall?
Right. Yeah, so compliance today tends to be reactive at most organizations
Hmm.
because they're waiting for the audit to happen to tell them that something is wrong. That's not good for a number of reasons. Um, Continuous control monitoring and the ability to monitor controls on an ongoing basis, I think, is the real differentiator here. So that the business is now in the driver's seat. They know whether controls are effective. They can take action to be able to fix those issues as soon as they show up. And they're really managing it proactively on an ongoing basis. Yes, an audit will come in and there'll be a validation check on things, but you're not waiting for that to tell you if something is broken. You've proactively approached it. I think if you take this a couple more steps further, I think we'll get to a point where technology will be able to alert us before something happens eventually, and then also to be able to do self-healing controls. And some of this already exists today. Like, some organizations, they redeploy their configurations on an ongoing basis, so they always have the golden image out there.
Mhm.
So there are ways that you can do self-healing as well, so that you're not even faced with sort of this remediation issue. So I think just really thinking about managing compliance in an ongoing basis versus it being this reactive approach. I mean, that is the old way of doing things.
Yeah, absolutely. Over to you,
Okay,
Jim. Yeah.
awesome. Thank you. So, this area that we were just talking about focuses on, technology automation, and you've kind of alluded to risks, right? Whether you're talking about the audit report, whether we're talking about reactive versus proactive. I wanted to ask, kind of kind of more of a bigger picture question, and that was, you know, in your estimation, in thinking about GRC as a set of tools and processes and practices, how can organizations utilize these kinds of methods to turn risk into really a strategic advantage? And any particular thoughts on that?
Yes. So we've been talking about compliance, obviously, but I think compliance and risk are closely aligned there, where you need control effectiveness to be able to inform risk management, right? So they're not separate. Like compliance, continuous monitoring can be a huge differentiator for risk management as well, because now you can look at continuous risk management and know whether controls are effective. And also, communicating risk to the business is absolutely critical. So, how you communicate to your leadership team, the board, risk is that language that gets communicated. But oftentimes people make the mistake of communicating in technical terms. So they're communicating technical jargon, they're not communicating business impact. And that is where risk can be so powerful because it should be communicating risk to the business outcomes and how security can mitigate or accelerate business outcomes. And that will tie back to your investments and to the controls that you may need to strengthen. And so risk is really that translation layer. Also, I think going back to the conversation we were having earlier, if you don't treat risk like a checkbox, it can be embedded into your business decisions and business thinking. So if you treat it like a checkbox, you're going to get that same level of value to it. If you embed it into what you're doing, you're going to start having the business to start thinking about risk management decisions. It's not just going to be security, it's also going to be the business, and that will ultimately get to better outcomes for the organization overall.
Understood. Understood. Okay, so that ends that section. The next thing we wanted to maybe talk to a little bit about was, a topic around leadership, diversity, and even advocacy. So if we think about this maybe from the leadership's perspective, I was wondering if you have any thoughts on maybe how organizations might implement different strategies, what those strategies might be used by leaders to help inspire the teams to really look at GRC as something that's going to be useful, impactful, meaningful, and not just something that's going to be taking away capabilities within the organization. Any thoughts on that?
Yes. Tons. I could talk probably all day about that. For me, GRC is a strategic enabler. It helps the organization to achieve its goals. And you might say, well, how? Three things. One is that compliance absolutely is a revenue enabler. Hands down, it is for new revenue and retaining existing customers. Number two is that risk management is helping the organization to manage risk to achieving those business goals, which is what everybody is trying to do. We're trying to get the business goals. We're not trying to have curveballs come in ahead, from that. And so risk management has to happen, and cyber is a really important area. And then third is governance. Governance is setting those clear requirements. It's aligning your requirements to your risk appetite, and it's providing that oversight to make sure that your program is executing and meeting those business goals. So between those three things, I think it's hard for anybody to say that it is not strategic. And it's really a mind shift from moving from that checkbox thinking to thinking about how it can enable those business goals.
Yes, so Laura, you already mentioned the communication aspects of like how do you um, communicate to the boards and executives, maybe the risk aspects of what the organization might be exposed to, not not focusing too much on the technical side, but framing that risk from the business perspective. So when you're trying to communicate the business value from a successful GRC program, are there any like lessons learned or takeaways in terms of maybe some metrics that you found helpful in terms of making it clear? It's not necessarily like a hazy idea that it provides value, but it's actually provable. Like, how do you think about communicating that as an enabler and growth driver overall?
Yes. Yeah. And when I think about again executive or board level reporting, I think GRC provides a really nice wrapper for the way that you're communicating security overall. It can provide that revenue impact very clearly. It can provide that business impact very clearly when you use risk as the wrapper. And when you think about KPIs, that's where governance comes in terms of what are your key performance indicators, making sure the program is successful. So if done really well, this should be what you're communicating. Specifically when it comes to investments as well, if there are risks that are not being fully addressed, translating that risk into business impact and then saying this is the investment that we need and what is that specific investment can be a very good way of getting
Mm,
investment buy-off. So for
mm,
example, with let's just say an organization hasn't yet rolled out multi-factor authentication.
mm,
So thinking about, okay, well, the business impact is that if an account gets compromised, I could have data exposure. And what is the impact of that? I could have reputational harm, I could have fines potentially, I could have revenue loss potentially. And so now you're talking about, okay, there's all these business impacts in terms of reputation, financial impact, revenue impact, and then you have the investment cost. And so now it becomes just an easier conversation to have about investments that need to happen to mitigate risk to help the business reach its goals.
yep. Jim?
Awesome. Awesome. All right, so I think you already answered my next question, which I was going to actually ask for you to, maybe talk about how GRC could be helpful in communicating to the board, but you just kind of laid out in my mind a whole bunch of really good ideas. Was there anything else you wanted to add to that in terms of formally in terms of communication to the board?
I think the last thing I'll say is that when in the risk management space, you also need to be thinking about emerging risks as well. So what is on the horizon? And that is a critical piece of what a CISO should be communicating. Not only what am I managing today, but what is potentially coming? How are we adapting to it? Thinking about security incidents. Are there other security incidents that people in our same industry are facing, or competitors? How are we prepared for those? So it can really help with the proactive nature of the communication as well as the overall maturity.
Got it. Got it. Awesome. Thank you. Okay, so the last topic that we wanted to talk to you about was going to get into the future of GRC. And that's where we like to oftentimes ask our guests to come in and look into their crystal ball and try to predict how things are going to potentially unfold in the coming years. So, what do you think the future of GRCs looks like from the executive perspective in the next, let's say, 2 to 5 years? Any particular thoughts on that?
Yes. As I alluded to a little bit earlier, I think the role of a GRC executive is going to be a strategic light leader guiding the organization to achieve its business goals. I think it's going to be a right-hand person for the CISO in terms of how to develop the security strategy, what are the program metrics, how are you communicating impact to the board? Because as I mentioned, risk should be one of those key ways. And embracing an engineering mindset to be able to embed controls into the business is going to be a key part of what that strategy looks like. Um, I view the GRC leader as the strategic tool. Like you are the strategic leader. Um, when you think about the security strategy, risk and program maturity are probably going to be some of your biggest drivers in your security strategy. Those often both come from GRC programs. The risk assessments, and then also if you're using, for example, like a NIST CSF or some other framework to assess your maturity, that's going to be a big feeder into your strategy. So they're going to be front and center in working across the security leadership team to help the CISO communicate upwards to the executive leadership team. And then also, their GRC is one of those functions that has breadth across all the security domains and also has existing relationships across the business. And so they're not only going to be key working within security, but also championing that message with business partners, building that strong relationship out in the larger ecosystem, and making sure that you have the support across the ecosystem to be successful with that strategy.
Great. So, Laura, when we consider the current GRC landscape, there seems to be like numerous frameworks and regulations that some of them like apparently overlap in a lot of ways, but some can be interpreted differently. So, how do you think it will evolve in the near or maybe midterm, like medium term future, in terms of like, do you think that they'll get more complex or convoluted, or do you see a way for them to converge into a more cohesive or simpler to navigate environment?
Yeah, great question. I think the regulatory landscape, the compliance certifications are only going to get more complex. I think the trend that you're seeing is each industry, each country, each oversight body, they are creating their own
Hmm.
flavor of
Yep.
requirements. That is where things are headed.
Hmm.
However, that doesn't mean that you have to manage your program that way.
Hmm.
I think thinking about, again, going back to that common control framework approach, thinking about a way to bring all of these requirements together, establish what are your security requirements, embedding in your external requirements together, and managing your program that way is the way that you scale and you achieve success. So you're still meeting all of those requirements, but you're not tackling it one by one by one by one. That process will not scale with the volume of requirements coming in.
So, do you wish that if it were like simpler, or maybe if there was a way to wave a magic wand and then just like have like three frameworks universal, like wherever
I
you
think
are,
those
whatever
days
you do.
are long gone, Alton.
Hmm.
So
Okay.
I don't think we're gonna go back to that personally.
All right.
Okay, so
Well,
we're almost at the end of our time with you today, Laura. But I wanted to ask, well, we have a couple questions, just two final questions. The first one was, if you could leave the audience with one call to action on rethinking GRC, what would it be?
View GRC as a strategic function. So what I say is where strategy meets GRC, growth follows. Don't allow your organization to get stuck in this checklist approach. That is a disservice to you and your organization. So really creating that clear narrative, changing the way that the organization is thinking about it, approach it as a way that is strategic, building it into controls, and really treat it as those guardrails that we spoke about in the very beginning. If you build those brakes and guardrails in, you will ultimately go faster over time. That is my call to action for everyone listening.
Awesome, awesome. Okay, last question. We're going to have you shift gears here for a moment, put on a different hat. We want to talk about the ISACA GWDC. We know that you're obviously involved in a lot of special events. Can you spend just a minute or two, talk a little bit about your role there and what types of events we've got planned for the membership base in the upcoming year?
Yes, happy to. So, as the director of special events, I am chartered with leading the two in-person conferences for ISACA Greater Washington, D.C. And these in-person conferences are focused on not only creating incredible learning opportunities, but also providing in-person networking and building a sense of community for our cybersecurity and IT audit professionals that are in and around the DC area. So for this upcoming year, those two events will be our first in-person conference will be November 13th at George Mason University. It is called Leading Tech, Transforming the Future of Cybersecurity and IT Audit Through Innovation, a She Leads Tech event. That event is going to have incredible sessions led by an exceptional lineup of female speakers, for CPEs. Registration is open, so get registered for that event. And then our second event will be in the spring. That will be called Future Tech DC. It's focused on trust, privacy, and AI, resilience and agility in the age of digital transformation. That event will be a three-track event, a general track, a government track, and a hands-on workshop track. We are incredibly excited about it. Details will be coming soon. Registration will be opening in the next couple months, and look forward to seeing you at both of these events. I would encourage you to show up. I have found that showing up for in-person events is so energizing, especially after so long of doing virtual events. So I would encourage for you and your organizations to show up at these events and be a part of the community.
Awesome. Awesome. Alton, any final words of wisdom?
I mean, it has been full of wisdom, this conversation. There's a lot of takeaways to think through, obviously, and like concluding with the GWDC events has been great. I'd say like I'm excited already for Future Tech DC and the rest. The last year's event was phenomenal. So yeah, it was a great conversation. I really enjoyed it. Thank you, Laura, again for your time here.
Yes, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Of course.
Absolutely. So everyone, that's going to go ahead and bring us to the end of this episode of Cyber Insights. Of course, again, quickly presented by the ISACA GWDC chapter. We want to again thank our guest, Ms. Laura Sawka, founder of Sawka Advisory Groups, for sharing her insights on how organizations can transform GRC from a compliance burden into a true business advantage. If you want to learn more about the ISACA Greater Washington, D.C. chapter, you can check out the chapter's website at www.isaca-gwdc.org, and you can learn about a lot of the upcoming opportunities that are at the actual site. Many of the things that Laura was talking about. We look forward to seeing you at our next broadcast of Cyber Insights. Thanks a lot for joining us. Have a great day, everyone. Thanks again. Bye-bye.